It was a typical day at the press conference. The cameras were rolling, reporters sat with pens poised, and the air was filled with the hum of murmurs and soft chatter. Pam Bondi, a prominent figure known for her calm and composed demeanor, stood at the podium ready to address the room. As usual, she had prepared for the usual questions, the ones about politics, the economy, the ongoing issues of the day. She had been in this situation countless times before. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But today was different. The crowd was quieter than usual, as though everyone could sense that something was coming. In the back of the room, a veteran stood up. His name was Michael Collins, a man whose face showed the weight of years spent in service. He had seen and lived through things most could never imagine. A decorated war hero, Michael had served his country with honor. But today, it wasn't his medals that mattered. It was his voice. His question wasn't about policy or politics. No, Michael had a personal question, one that carried with it the burden of his own experiences, his sacrifices, and the pain that had come with them. It wasn't something that could be ignored or brushed aside. His question, his challenge, was aimed directly at Pam Bondi, and it would leave everyone in the room breathless. The room fell silent as Michael's deep, steady voice rang out, cutting through the usual noise. "Pam," he began, his words firm yet filled with a quiet urgency. "For years, I've watched you stand up for what you believe in. But what about the men and women who fought for this country? What about the ones who sacrificed everything for freedom? When will we, the veterans, be heard? When will you finally do something that really makes a difference for us?" The room went still. Every eye turned to Pam. The reporters, the cameramen, the audience. They all waited for her response. Some may have even expected her to dismiss the question, to laugh it off or brush it aside as so many before her had done with questions that were uncomfortable or too direct. But this wasn't just any question. This was coming from a man who had lived through battles most couldn't even imagine. This wasn't the time to give a rehearsed answer or hide behind political jargon. Pam Bondi was in a moment of confrontation. The question wasn't just about veterans' issues or the political struggles they faced. No, it was deeper. It was about respect. It was about whether Pam, someone with so much power and influence, would stand up for the people who had given their all for the country. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Pam stood there, her eyes locked with Michael's. She could feel the weight of his words. His question wasn't just pointed at her. It was aimed at the entire system, at everything that had been overlooked and ignored. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting for her to answer. The pressure was on. Her hands gripped the sides of the podium, her fingers tightening as if she was holding onto her composure. It was clear this wasn't an ordinary question. It wasn't one she could brush aside with a smile or a quick answer. This was a challenge, and the world was watching to see how she would respond. Pam cleared her throat and paused, the silence in the room growing louder. She knew that whatever came next would be what everyone remembered. This moment, this question, would define the rest of the press conference. The tension was palpable. Would she respond with respect and understanding, or would she crumble under the pressure? The room held its breath, waiting for Pam Bondi's answer. What she did next would shock everyone. But first, the question hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Michael Collins had made his stand, and now Pam Bondi had to make hers. The silence in the room stretched on, and every eye in the room was fixed on Pam Bondi. Michael's question echoed in her mind. When will we, the veterans, be heard? It was a simple yet powerful question, one that cut deep. There was no easy way out. The question wasn't just about policy. It wasn't about the usual political talking points that Pam could sidestep with ease. No, this was personal. This was a challenge to her integrity. Pam's gaze locked onto Michael Collins, the veteran who had bravely stood up to confront her. His face was hard, yet there was an underlying sadness in his eyes. His words were not just a request for change. They were a plea for respect, respect for the men and women who had sacrificed everything for their country. And in that moment, Pam knew that her response could either make her look like a leader who understood or someone who was simply playing politics for the cameras. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm the rising tension inside her. Her mind raced. She had been through so many press conferences before, answering questions from every angle, but this moment felt different. She could feel the eyes of the reporters and the cameras trained on her. It wasn't just about answering a question. It was about showing the world who she truly was. For a brief moment, Pam considered sidestepping the issue. She could dismiss Michael's question as one of many rhetorical political inquiries and move on with the press conference. But something inside her held her back. She couldn't ignore the passion in Michael's voice, nor could she ignore the truth behind his words. This wasn't about her. This was about something much bigger. The forgotten voices of the veterans who had given everything and asked for so little in return. Pam opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. Her mind searched for the perfect response. What could she say that would show the world that she truly cared? She wasn't a veteran, but she had witnessed firsthand the struggles of those who had served. She had heard their stories, seen their sacrifices, but somehow, those voices had been drowned out in the noise of politics and bureaucracy. Finally, Pam spoke, her voice steady but carrying a weight that surprised even her. "Michael, I hear you," she said, the words coming out more slowly than usual. "I hear your pain, and I hear the pain of every veteran who feels overlooked, underappreciated, and forgotten." There was a pause. Michael's eyes remained fixed on her, unblinking. He was listening, but the skepticism in his eyes was clear. He had heard empty promises before. He had heard the same old words from politicians who promised change, but never followed through. And Pam knew this. She understood the depth of his frustration. "I can't change the past," Pam continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I promise you, I will do everything in my power to ensure that the voices of our veterans are heard. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten." The room was still silent, but something shifted. It was as if the tension in the air had momentarily broken, replaced with a sense of anticipation. Everyone was waiting for what came next. Would Michael accept her words, or would he challenge her further? Michael took a step forward, his eyes still locked onto Pam's. For a moment, Pam wondered if he would push her further, demand more, but instead, he did something unexpected. He nodded, just once, and then said in a calm, almost weary voice, "We've heard enough promises, Pam. What we need now is action." His words hung in the air, like a final challenge. The room seemed to hold its breath again. What Pam had said wasn't enough. Not yet. Michael wasn't asking for more empty words. He was asking for real, meaningful action. And in that moment, Pam Bondi realized that her words alone wouldn't be enough. The veterans' challenge was not one that could be solved by a speech or a promise. It was going to take real, hard work. Pam took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had just been confronted by one of the bravest voices in the room, and she knew that this moment would define her. It would define her leadership. She had a choice to make. Would she stand by her words, or would she take the next step toward making a real change? The audience waited. The world watched. And for the first time in a long while, Pam Bondi wasn't sure what the next move would be. The room remained tense, the air thick with expectation. Michael's challenge had shaken Pam Bondi, but she couldn't show it. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment, every shift in her expression. The reporters' pens scratched on their notepads, ready to turn her next move into the headline of the evening. Michael Collins' words echoed in her mind. What we need now is action. He had asked for something she could no longer avoid. A concrete commitment, a promise that would not be just words, but backed up by real action. The thought weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had always been good at speaking her mind, at making promises, but now she was being asked to walk the talk. And suddenly, everything felt so much more real. Pam's gaze shifted to the rest of the room, where other veterans stood, some sitting, others watching closely. Their eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She could see it. They had heard politicians speak before, seen them stand at podiums, and promise reforms that never came to pass. She knew that it wasn't just Michael's question that she had to answer. It was the question on the minds of every veteran in that room. Will you make it different? The pressure was mounting. Every second that passed without her response felt like an eternity. Pam could feel the eyes of the world on her. She had been in countless press conferences before, but this felt like the most important moment of her career. Would she meet the challenge head-on or falter in the face of scrutiny? The reporters seemed to hold their breath, too, waiting for her to say something more than just vague promises. Pam could feel their eyes drilling into her, eager for something substantial, something that would give them the story they were waiting for. They were already thinking about the headline. Pam Bondi responds to veterans' challenge. But is it enough? The thought made her skin prickle. She couldn't let them turn this into another story about empty words. Her heartbeat quickens. Pam Bondi's heart was pounding, but she knew that showing any sign of weakness would be disastrous. The veteran in front of her, and everyone else in the room, had seen enough of the same empty promises. They were asking for real change, not just more talk. She shifted her posture, standing up straighter, as though trying to shed the weight of the moment. She had to make them believe her. She had to make them understand that she was not like the others who had come before her. Her voice, though calm, began to gain a firmness it hadn't had before. "Michael," she began, locking eyes with the veteran once more. "I hear you. And I hear the thousands of veterans like you who feel that the promises made to them have gone unfulfilled." Her words weren't as smooth as usual, and she could feel the sincerity behind each one. This wasn't a rehearsed response. This was her truth. She was no longer just defending her position or trying to save face in front of the cameras. She was speaking from a place of genuine acknowledgement, and it was clear from the slight change in her tone that she had finally internalized the gravity of Michael's challenge. "I know you've heard promises before," Pam continued, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the moment. "And I know that actions speak louder than words. But I'm asking you to trust me when I say that I will make sure your voices are heard, and I will fight for the veterans who have given so much for this country." There was a noticeable pause. Pam's words seemed to hang in the air, suspended by the tension that had built up in the room. She could feel Michael's eyes on her, searching for any sign of insincerity. But Pam didn't flinch. She stood firm, her gaze unwavering. She knew that this was her moment to prove that she meant what she said. It wasn't about talking her way out of the situation. It was about showing that she was ready to act. A subtle shift in the room. The room, still silent, seemed to shift. The veterans who had been watching her closely began to exchange glances, some nodding in quiet agreement. The reporters, though still wary, seemed to ease up slightly. They could see that this wasn't just another politician trying to dodge the tough questions. There was something different about the way Pam Bondi was speaking now. Michael Collins stood still, his face still serious, but there was a hint of something softer in his expression. Maybe it was the sincerity in her voice. Maybe it was the way Pam had chosen to respond, not with words to justify herself, but with a real promise to do better. For a moment, it seemed as though the pressure had shifted slightly, but it was far from over. Michael wasn't going to let her off that easily. He wasn't looking for just a promise. He wanted to see real, lasting change. And Pam Bondi knew that the hardest part of this moment was still ahead. Delivering on her word. As Michael opened his mouth to speak again, the room held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Would he accept her words, or would he press her further? The tension, thick as ever, was far from gone. In fact, it was only just beginning to intensify. Michael Collins wasn't done. His face remained serious, but there was an unmistakable edge to his expression now. The crowd could feel it. They weren't just watching a press conference anymore. They were witnessing a moment of reckoning. The veteran had laid down a challenge, and Pam Bondi's words, no matter how sincere, hadn't quite won him over. "I appreciate your words, Pam," Michael said, his voice calm, but it carried an unmistakable firmness. "But words aren't what we need. We've been hearing empty promises for far too long. We need action, real action. Not just for today, but for tomorrow, for the future of veterans across this country." The pressure in the room grew once again. Pam had spoken with confidence, but Michael's response hit hard. It was as if he was calling her bluff, daring her to prove that she meant what she said. And in front of cameras, reporters, and the veterans who filled the room, Pam knew that there was no turning back now. She had tried to show understanding, tried to assure Michael that she had heard his pain, his frustration, but the truth was that the veterans were tired of hearing words. They had heard too many politicians speak with the same promises, yet never follow through. The last few minutes had felt like a glimmer of hope, but now it felt like it was all hanging by a thread. Pam's hands, which had been gripping the sides of the podium, slowly relaxed. Her mind raced, processing the weight of what Michael had said. What could she do now to prove that this was more than just talk? The room waits. The room was on the edge of its seat, waiting for Pam to respond. It was clear now that this wasn't going to be an easy moment for her. The pressure was suffocating, but it was also galvanizing. She had worked her entire career to get to this point, but now it wasn't about politics or public approval. It was about standing up for the veterans, for the heroes who had been ignored for too long. Pam took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. This was her test. No one cared about her previous achievements or her past speeches right now. This was her moment to act, to step beyond words and prove that she could be more than just a politician in a room full of tough questions. She needed to show that she was capable of change. She finally spoke, her voice calm but now filled with the undeniable fire of determination. "You're right," she said, her eyes meeting Michael's once more. "Words aren't enough. I hear you, and I've heard so many stories from veterans like you, stories that need to be addressed. I know we can't keep offering the same empty promises. I won't sit here and pretend that everything is okay." There was a pause, the room still holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Pam had admitted that she had heard the veterans' stories. She had admitted that the promises made were too often empty. But was she ready to take the next step? Was she willing to take the necessary action? "I can't make promises I can't keep," Pam continued, her voice steady. "But what I can promise is that I will work alongside you and the rest of the veteran community to create real change. Not just talk, not just speeches. We need policy that serves the veterans who have given everything for this country. And I'll do everything in my power to make sure it happens." The challenge intensifies. There was a murmur in the room. It wasn't a sound of full acceptance, but more of curiosity. The reporters exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to interpret her words. Was this another political ploy, or was it a real shift in attitude? Michael Collins, standing at the front of the room, still hadn't budged. His eyes were focused, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he was waiting for Pam to offer more, to lay out the specifics of her plan, to show him, and everyone else in the room, that she wasn't just talking. That's what he wanted. He didn't need more vague promises. He wanted action, and he wanted it now. Pam could feel the weight of his gaze upon her. There was no room for error. She had spoken with honesty, but now Michael's challenge still stood. He wanted to know how she planned to ensure that veterans would no longer be ignored. The world watched, and time seemed to stretch. Would she give him the specifics, or would she take the easy way out? The press conference, which had started with a simple question, had turned into an intense battle of words. And the outcome of this moment, it was still uncertain. As the silence grew, the audience waited, each person hanging on the edge of their seat, waiting for Pam's next move. Would she rise to the challenge, or would she let the moment slip away? The tension was palpable, and the stakes had never been higher. Pam Bondi could feel the weight of the room pressing in on her. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the entire world was waiting for her next move. Michael Collins had laid down a challenge she couldn't ignore. He wasn't asking for a vague promise. He wanted concrete action, something that would bring real change for the veterans who had fought for their country and now felt forgotten. The tension was almost unbearable. Pam had been in countless press conferences, had answered questions from all kinds of angles. But this was different. This wasn't a political game. This wasn't about scoring points or making headlines. This was about a man, a veteran, standing up in front of the world and asking for justice. And Pam knew that what she said in this moment would resonate far beyond the press conference room. It would echo throughout the veteran community. It could define her entire career. She stood at the podium, feeling her hands once again gripping its edges. The silence that filled the room was deafening. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The cameras were still rolling. The reporter's eyes locked on her, waiting for her to step up and prove that she wasn't just another politician with empty promises. And Michael, standing at the front of the room, hadn't moved. His face was still stoic, waiting for the answer he needed. Pam could feel the eyes of everyone on her. The weight of their expectations hung heavily. She knew that she had to do more than just repeat empty words. She needed to show them. Show the veterans. Show Michael. Show the world. That she truly understood the gravity of the issue. And more than that, she needed to prove that she was willing to act. With a deep breath, Pam finally spoke again, her voice strong but filled with a quiet resolve. Michael, you're right. I've heard the words of veterans who feel like they've been forgotten, and I understand the frustration that comes with hearing empty promises year after year. Her eyes didn't leave his as she continued. But I'm not here to make empty promises. I'm here to tell you that I am ready to fight for you, to fight for the people who gave everything for this country. The room was still. It wasn't the thunderous applause or the cheers she might have hoped for, but it was a shift. The room was listening now. Pam could feel it. This wasn't just about what she was saying anymore. It was about how she was saying it. There was sincerity in her voice, in the way she carried herself. She had stepped away from the scripted politician and was showing a side of herself that few had ever seen before. But Michael wasn't finished. He stepped forward once more, his eyes narrowing slightly as he addressed Pam. Talk is easy, Pam. We've all heard it before. The promises, the speeches. What we need is real, measurable change. How can you assure us that we won't be forgotten again? Pam hesitated for only a moment. This wasn't going to be an easy answer, and it certainly wasn't going to be a quick fix. But it was time to take ownership. It was time to show that she wasn't just another person trying to smooth over the issue with a few kind words. She was in this for the long haul. I can't promise that change will happen overnight, Pam began, but I can promise that I will be a voice for veterans. I will push for policy changes that address the real issues, not just in the short term, but for the future. Whether it's health care, job opportunities, or support for mental health, these are the issues we need to tackle head-on. There was a shift in the air. Pam's response wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't a magical solution to everything veterans had been facing. But it was a promise, a commitment to work on solutions. Michael and the other veterans in the room may not have had all the answers either, but they could see that Pam was willing to work alongside them to bring about real change. That in itself was a start. The reporters, too, seemed to sense that the tone of the room had shifted. The tension that had been thick earlier had softened, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. This was a conversation now, not a confrontation. But it was still clear that Pam Bondi had a long road ahead of her if she were to prove that her words could be turned into action. Michael nodded, not in full approval, but in acknowledgement. He wasn't done pressing her, but there was a sense that something had changed in the dynamic between them. The veteran wasn't looking for a political answer. He was looking for someone who was willing to stand up for those who had been silenced for too long. And in this moment, Pam had begun to show that she was willing to be that person. As the room remained quiet, Pam's heart beat a little faster, but she felt a new kind of strength. She had been tested, and while the battle was far from over, she had passed the first hurdle. She had shown that she was willing to face the challenge head-on. Now, the next steps would be the hardest part. Could she keep her promise? Could she truly make the change that so many veterans have been waiting for? The press conference wasn't over, and the answers weren't clear yet, but one thing was certain. This moment would define everything that came next, and for Pam Bondi, it was only the beginning. Pam Bondi's words had settled in the room, but the weight of them didn't dissipate. As soon as the press conference ended, the reporters crowded around, microphones and cameras aimed at her, asking follow-up questions with increasing intensity. The tension in the air still hadn't completely lifted. Michael Collins' challenge had struck a chord, not just with Pam, but with everyone in that room. Now it was time to face the public's scrutiny. The media outlets were already buzzing, with some calling Pam's response a turning point, while others remained skeptical, questioning whether her promises would lead to any real change. But for Pam, the real test had just begun. She knew the cameras would focus on her words, but it was the actions that would ultimately define her response to Michael's challenge. Her team had prepared her for a post-conference interview, but the questions were relentless. What's your next step? What specific policy changes will you be advocating for? How soon will veterans start seeing improvements? Pam could feel the pressure mounting again. She had said the right things in the heat of the moment, but now the world was waiting for her to make good on those words. There would be no turning back now. Behind the scenes, as she gathered herself for the interview, Pam's thoughts began to spiral. The press was quick to dig up any past mistakes, any missteps she had made, trying to highlight every moment she hadn't fully delivered on promises in the past. The veteran community, too, wasn't easily satisfied. They had been let down before. Would they believe her? Would they trust her? Or would they see her words as just another politician making empty claims? A shift in strategy. As Pam sat down for the post-conference interview, she knew she couldn't afford to come across as defensive. This was a pivotal moment in her career, and she needed to show that she was serious about following through. But there was a problem. Words could only go so far. She had made a promise, yes, but now she needed a plan. I understand the skepticism, Pam began, her voice calm but determined. And I know that veterans have heard promises before, only to be let down. But I'm not here to offer you empty words. I'm here to show you that I will be accountable. She paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the conversation and the eyes that were upon her. My next step is clear. I will be sitting down with veteran organizations, with advocacy groups, and with experts to ensure we're not just addressing the symptoms of the issue, but the root causes. This isn't a one-time solution. It's an ongoing process. We're talking about healthcare, jobs, mental health, and housing. All of these must be improved for veterans to feel truly supported. Pam leaned forward, her tone gaining more conviction as she spoke. I'll be leading the charge on the legislative front to make sure that veterans receive the benefits they were promised when they served this country. This is not just about talking. This is about taking action, and we'll start by revisiting key policies that need reform. The interviewer's questions continued, probing deeper into her stance on veterans' issues, but Pam felt a sense of control she hadn't felt before. She wasn't just responding. She was shaping the conversation, showing that she wasn't running away from the challenge. Behind closed doors, after the interview ended, Pam retreated to her office, where the full weight of what she had committed to started to sink in. The room felt small as her team gathered around, ready to debrief and discuss the next steps. But Pam was no longer just thinking about the next press appearance. She was thinking about the long-term actions needed to fulfill her promise. Do we have the legislative support for these reforms? She asked her team, her voice steady, but with an edge of urgency. We need to know what we're up against. If we're going to make any headway, we need to get the ball rolling immediately. Her advisors began outlining the necessary steps, each one as complex as the next. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be opposition, there would be roadblocks, and it would take time. But for the first time in a while, Pam felt a sense of determination she hadn't expected. Michael Collins had forced her into a corner, And while she hadn't been ready for it, now that she was there, she felt driven to prove herself. The pressure mounts. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Pam worked tirelessly behind the scenes, meeting with veteran groups, drafting proposals, and pushing for new legislation. Every day felt like a step closer to fulfilling her promise, but she knew the real challenge wasn't in the meetings or the paperwork. It was in the public's eye. Every move she made, every new policy proposal, would be scrutinized by both the media and the veterans she had promised to fight for. Pam had seen the headlines. Pam Bondi's promise. Will she deliver? Veterans hold their breath as politician makes pledge. Every word from her mouth, every decision she made, was now under the microscope. And the veterans, they were still waiting. Some were hopeful, others cynical, but all of them were watching closely, waiting for Pam Bondi to prove that her words in that press conference weren't just another round of empty promises. An unfinished journey. As Pam looked out of her office window, the weight of her position settled over her once more. The journey ahead would not be easy, and the road would be filled with challenges. But one thing was clear. Pam Bondi had taken the first step. She had made a promise, and now it was up to her to make sure she followed through. The fallout from the press conference was far from over, but Pam was ready. It was no longer just about the public eye. It was about doing the work. And no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be, she knew one thing. She wasn't backing down. The fight for veterans had only just begun. Months had passed since Pam Bondi's press conference with Michael Collins, but the pressure and expectations had only grown. The veterans she had promised to fight for were watching closely, holding their breath as each new development unfolded. Pam knew that the honeymoon period was over. It was no longer about words. It was about results. The challenge Michael had laid before her still lingered in the air, a constant reminder that she had committed herself to something bigger than her career or her image. Now, the public was waiting to see if she could make good on her promises. Pam's team had worked tirelessly, drafting new policy proposals, meeting with veteran organizations, and lobbying lawmakers for the changes that were desperately needed. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, pushbacks, and moments where it felt like everything was moving at a crawl. But despite the obstacles, Pam had a singular focus: to show the veterans and the nation that she could be trusted. A public test. One particularly hot afternoon, Pam stood before a packed auditorium at a veterans advocacy conference. This was another critical moment in her journey, a chance to prove to the veterans that she wasn't just making empty speeches. She had been invited to speak on behalf of a new bill she had been pushing for, one that promised better health care access and job opportunities for veterans who had struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. It was one of the first tangible results of her promise to Michael and the nation's veterans. As she approached the podium, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some faces were hopeful, others skeptical. Pam felt their eyes on her, sensing the weight of their expectations. She could feel the room's doubt and hope collide in the air around her. This was it, the moment of truth. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak, her voice clear and steady. "I'm here today because I believe that our veterans deserve more than just words. You deserve action. You deserve policies that will make your lives better today and in the years to come." There was a silence in the room as Pam continued, detailing the new measures the bill would include: improved health care access, better mental health support, job training programs, and housing initiatives. She laid out the specifics, her voice unwavering. But underneath it all, there was something else, a quiet resolve. She knew this bill wasn't the end, but it was a sign of progress, a sign that she was serious about keeping her promise to Michael and the veterans who had been waiting too long. A positive shift. The room listened intently. There were no interruptions, no questions, just a quiet attentiveness. Pam had been in enough public speaking situations to know when people were just hearing words and when they were truly engaged. She could feel the shift. The veterans in the room were finally beginning to see that this wasn't just another politician offering empty promises. As the speech ended, the applause was more than just polite. There was genuine recognition of the hard work Pam had put into drafting this bill and the effort she had made to be present with the veterans community. She had proven herself in that moment, not with grand gestures, but with tangible action and commitment. And for the first time, she could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders, even just a little. But Pam knew this was only the beginning. This bill needed to pass through Congress, and that was no small feat. It would take all her political savvy, all her connections, and all the momentum she had built up over the past few months. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since that fateful press conference, Pam Bondi felt like she was truly on the path to change. The continued battle. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, debates, and negotiations. Pam fought tirelessly behind the scenes, working with both her colleagues and veteran advocacy groups to secure support for the bill. It wasn't easy. There were opponents who questioned the cost, others who felt the measures didn't go far enough. But Pam pushed forward, determined to keep her promise. And then, after months of intense work, the day came. The bill was ready to be voted on. Pam stood in front of the cameras again. But this time, the stakes were higher. The moment had come to see whether the hard work and determination would pay off. As the voting session began, Pam's heart raced. She wasn't just waiting for the results for herself. She was waiting for the veterans. They had been counting on her. The room was filled with anticipation, and Pam could feel the tension as each vote was cast. When the final vote was tallied, Pam let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The bill had passed. The veterans had won. Pam had done it. The promise she had made months ago had come to fruition, and while it wasn't the end, it was a monumental step forward, a promise fulfilled. The reaction from the veterans community was overwhelming. For the first time in a long time, they felt seen. They felt heard, and they saw that their fight wasn't in vain. Pam had done what so many before her had failed to do. She had turned words into action. But Pam knew this victory wasn't hers alone. It was a shared success, one that had taken the efforts of many. She had proven herself, yes, but it was the unity of the veteran community, the advocacy groups, and the support from her colleagues that had made this possible. As Pam stood on the steps of the Capitol building, looking out at the crowd of veterans and supporters who had gathered to celebrate the passage of the bill, she couldn't help but think of that moment in the press conference with Michael Collins. She had been tested, and she had come through it, not with just promises, but with real change. This was the start of something bigger. Pam knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but she had taken the first step. And with that, the fight for the veterans would continue, stronger than ever.